In the earliest chapters of 1 Samuel, before we're introduced even to the life of David, the Israelites at one point take the Ark of the Covenant out to the battlefield, thinking that as some kind of amulet that they might win the battle against the Philistines. Instead of winning the battle, however, the Ark of the Covenant was captured, and they took it to Philistia. However, several events occurred in Philistia, kind of portending evil, and then things occurred to the Philistines because of the ark that was in their possession. They sent it back by an ox cart back to Israel. At that point, the Israelites took the Ark of the Covenant and put it in a place that was near a place called Gibeon. And then later they moved it to Gibeon. That became, as you recall, one of the chief high places, if not the chief high place of Israel. But in that battle also, we need to note this, that the old tabernacle city called Shiloh was absolutely destroyed. It is implied in 1 Samuel chapter 4, but it is stated very plainly in Psalm 78, verses 60 through 64. We are told there that the Philistines destroyed Shiloh, they burned the young men with fire, and they killed the older men, and all of the priests they slayed with the sword. As a matter of fact, they killed the women also, for there are no women there to lament. Consequently, Shiloh, even though it had been the location of the ark and the location of the tabernacle, was no more. Consequently, the Israelites took the Ark of the Covenant and pieces of the tabernacle, and they placed it now in Gibeon. This was, of course, even before David was born. However, when David came to the throne, finally, many chapters later in Samuel, and many years later, David recognized that they needed a central location for worship. Not only was it that way for unity's sake of Israel, but he wanted to honor God and have the house of God built in the city of Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, he had not taken Jerusalem yet, and he does so in 2 Samuel chapter 5. And then after that capture of the city of Jerusalem from the Jebusites, he decided that the tabernacle would now be located in Jerusalem, and he wanted to build not simply a tabernacle, not erect simply the tent, but he would actually build a temple. However, as we know, David was not allowed to do so because God disallowed him. And the reason was because David was a man of war, a man of blood. David, therefore, compiled all of the materials that was necessary to build the temple. As a matter of fact, from all of the wars that he had participated in, he was able to capture the gold, the silver, the brass, the bronze, precious stones, onyx, and he had them in a treasury house in the city of Jerusalem. And there he kept them, hoping that he would build the temple. But it was not to be his task. It would fall to his son Solomon, whose name means peace, and Solomon would build the temple. And so he turned to 1 Kings chapter 4, 5, and 6. Solomon's building of the temple is what we want to examine. The work actually begins in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, we're told in 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1. It was in the 2nd month of the year, that was the month of Ziv or Ziv. That was corresponding to our time of May. You might recall, of course, that the Jewish year actually begins in corresponding to our April, and so the 2nd month would correspond to our May. The work begins then just as summertime is coming on. The building of the temple would take 7 years. As a matter of fact, the entire building project of Solomon would take 20 years to complete because his house, his own palace, would take 13 years to build. Consequently, 20 years, Jerusalem was a beehive of activity building the temple. It is interesting to note that heathen nations referred to Jerusalem as simply the Temple of Solomon. They called it Hierosolyma, which is Hero, which would be the temple, means temple, and Solomon, Soloma, Hierosolyma, that's how they called the city of Jerusalem itself. Solomon, therefore, built the temple that David had planned to build. And what a magnificent structure it was. It was actually one of the ancient wonders of the world, gilded in gold and silver. Like on the picture that is in front of you, it actually occupied the top of a mountain. Many years later, rabbis would say, as they traveled to Jerusalem, that it looked like simply snow on top of a mountain. And they thought it was so picturesque to be able to come from the hills north in Galilee, traveling down to Jerusalem, to be able to see from afar the beautiful temple that Solomon and later, of course, Herod refurbished. That was Solomon's building. However, Solomon also, before building the temple, we need to note that he inherited a relationship that his father had had with Hiram, king of Tyre. That would be in Phoenicia, which was located north by northwest of Israel. Hiram was friends with David. Solomon inherited that friendship. Consequently, Solomon contracted with Hiram, king of Tyre, for contract labor to come down into Jerusalem and work. Solomon agreed to furnish wheat and barley, a lot of agricultural goods to the Phoenicians if they would provide the workers, and that's exactly the agreement that they struck. Hiram, therefore, provided so many artisans and so many individuals that were able to build and construct and to carve that was not in Israel. For example, there were Sodonian, as we see on the list, Sodonian Woodcutters. Sidon was a town that is in Phoenicia, and they're Sodonian Woodcutters. The Sodonian Woodcutters were joined by thousands of Israelites that Solomon had conscripted into labor, and they went into the mountains of Lebanon and took down all of the beautiful cedars of Lebanon. Today, there are only just a few of them up there. In that day, the giant cedars of Lebanon adorned the hills, and all of the workers from Hiram, the workers from Solomon, stripped the mountain of the cedars. And what they did was they took the logs straight to the sea, which was in Phoenicia, far north now from Israel, built rafts. They had put them in the water, strapped them together in raft form, then brought them down the sea line to Joppa, and there they unloaded the rafts, and one log at a time, about 35 miles trek up the mountain to Jerusalem, they took the logs, and so the cedar was the logs, or the logs furnished the cedar that Solomon used to build the house. So Sodonian woodcutters, there were hewers and bevelers. That would be individuals who worked the stones. We'll talk about some of the stones of the temple a little bit later. But these hewers, those were individuals that were able to cut out of rock. And then the bevelers, those who would smooth it out, and they were able to fit the rocks together so tightly that one could not slide pieces of paper between it. That's amazing to think about the time frame, about 970 years BC, that they were able to work that way. Not only so, but there were cedar cutters. Those were the ones who furnished the workmanship to create the wood craftsmanship that they used to build the tabernacle, to make the pillars. One of the interesting buildings that Solomon made was called the House of the Forest of Lebanon. That apparently, that you read that in 1 Kings chapter 4, the House of the Cedars of Lebanon was apparently an armory. Some say it was a banquet hall, but it was adorned with giant cedar posts inside of it, several rows of them, and so it was called the House of the Forest of Lebanon. Solomon built that as well. All of these things, as well as his own palace, constructed by these workmen. Not only so, but there were gold and brass workmen. These were individuals who were able to carve in brass and be able to make carvings in gold and silver. They made the furnishings of the temple. They made the furniture. All of these things that these workmen were able to make. Then we have bronze casters. Who are the bronze casters? These were individuals who actually went down to the Jordan Valley, the Dead Sea area, and able out of the clay to make molds, and then they were able to make the brass molten and poured it into these clay molds, and they were able to make furnishings that way. So they had bronze casters, they had carvers, they had engravers, individuals who were in the temple itself, actually carving the beautiful pomegranates with which he adorned the temple. Then we have dyers. Who is a dyer? What's a dyer? Those are individuals who dyed the cloth. Now, it was a lot more difficult in those days than it is today to dye the cloth. Purple, of course, was the sign of royalty, but one of the reasons that was the case was because it was so rare and therefore very expensive. They were able to get purple by going to Phoenicia, off the coastline in the water, and get the murex, that is a mollusk, a shelled fish, out of the water, and out of the shell draw out the purple and then use it to stain the cloth. And that was the process by which they made the purple. Same thing regarding scarlet. They had a trumpet fish that they were able to catch off the coast of Phoenicia, and then they took the scarlet coloring out of the body of the fish and then dyed the cloth to make scarlet. And that's how they did it. So they had dyers, they had weavers, embroiderers. These were the individuals who made the huge curtains that separated the most holy place from the holy place in Solomon's temple. The head over all of these individuals was the name of Hiram. This is not to be confused, by the way, with the king of Phoenicia, who is also called Hiram, but this was a man who was a master craftsman, and his name was Hiram as well. He was actually the son of a Jewish woman. She was from the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a Tyrian. So Hiram was over all of these workers, and Solomon put them to labor, and for 20 years they worked on building not only the palace, the temple, all of the structures all about Jerusalem. But I want to notice something regarding the place that they chose. If you look at the map of Jerusalem, I want to notice simply this. This is a topographical map of Jerusalem, and the topo map might be confusing because north is to the right on the map, and you can see the compass on the side. North is on the right. You're looking at Jerusalem from the bottom side, which is the eastern side. So Jerusalem itself has three valleys within it, three distinct valleys. Now today there are basically only two. The middle valley, the Tyropian valley, as you can see it in the middle, has been really covered up, buried, and then filled in by the builders over the centuries. But in that day there was the Hinnom Valley, which was on the far western side of the city, and it ran down the south side and met that which was on the eastern side, the Kidron Valley. Those are the three valleys of Jerusalem. The city itself, however, was built upon four primary hills. And those hills on the western side of the city, that would be the top of the map, included number one, the only one that's listed there is Mount Zion. You can see from the map that Mount Zion is the largest of them. North of that, you see there's a step slope coming into Mount Zion from the north, and that was called Akra. So on the western side was Mount Zion and Akra. On this side, the eastern side, was Mount Moriah, and then also Ophel, which was going down south from Mount Moriah, just the step portion of it. It was Mount Moriah that David chose to build the temple. However, during David's lifetime, Moriah was actually owned by someone else. That man's name was Araunah. He was a Jebusite, that is one of the original Canaanite peoples that still lived in the environment of Jerusalem, and he owned that mountain. David went and offered to buy it from him. Araunah offered to give it to him, and David makes a famous statement. He said, I am not going to offer to God, he had planned to build the temple here, I'm not going to offer to God that which cost me nothing. And he insisted on buying it from him at a price. And so a price he paid, and Mount Moriah became the place where the temple would be located. The city itself, the old city, was located on this western side, or rather the eastern side, Mount Moriah and Ophel. And you'll see it from the next picture. This is simply giving you the hills, the four hills. There are primarily four hills there, but here's the picture of what the city looks like. That is in Solomon's time, an artist rendition. We have Ophel, the bottom part of the city, Moriah, the top part where the temple is built. And that was, of course, David's plan to do that God just allowed him to do it. So Solomon was able to accomplish it, and he accomplished the temple itself in 7 years. Something else interesting, however, we need to note, and that is the forced labor that Solomon utilized to build the temple. The forced labor included three different categories of individuals. Number one were the native, freeborn Israelites, and they were conscripted to work, 30,000 of them. Not only so, but there were resident aliens. They're called the Gerim. They were the Phoenicians, many of them were, or other foreigners who lived among them, and so they were resident aliens. They were also conscripted to work. Hiram's paid subjects would fall into that category. And then number three, one of the most interesting is there were slaves. And of the slaves, there were, in that category, three classes themselves. Number one, those were slaves that were taken in war. Number two, there were slaves that were bought into slavery. That is, they were in debt. And according to Jewish law, the Old Testament law, if you were in debt, you sold yourself into slavery or hired work, at least for indentured servitude, for at least 7 years. So there were many of those also. So there are slaves that were captured in war. There were slaves that were sold for debt. And then there were also vassal Canaanites. Who are the vassal Canaanites? You might recall that when Joshua first came into the city, or rather the country of Israel, that he made a pact unknowingly with people who were just on the other side of the mountain, Canaanite individuals. And they had portrayed themselves as coming from afar, a foreign country, and they asked Joshua not to attack them. He made the pact with them, and then he discovered that they were Canaanites who lived among them. Canaanites, therefore, were there, but he made them hewers of wood and drawers of water. That is, they were slaves among the Israelites. Now, among the slaves, note the numbers of them that Solomon used. There were 80,000 quarrymen. 80,000. That is, there were stone quarries not only in the environment of Jerusalem, but also in the hills regarding and near the Dead Sea. So they were 80,000 men that worked. Actually, these 80,000 men were divided up into different classes, and some of them would work some of the year, some of them worked some other time of the year. There were 70,000 burden bearers, individuals who carried all the material. And then they were under the charge of 3,600 Israelites that were over all of the slaves. And I want to stop right here for just a few moments, and I want you to think about the slavery that occurred in not only biblical times, but in Solomon's building of the temple, but what the Bible teaches pertaining to slavery itself. Because when we go to the topic of slavery, what we have right here in the building of Solomon's temple, many people ask, what about slavery, and what does the Bible say regarding it? Solomon, of course, freely utilized the slaves. I don't know if that was his own idea. Remember, he did have a father-in-law that was from Egypt. He had an Egyptian wife. And maybe his father-in-law had given him the idea of slavery, but be that as it may, Solomon used thousands and thousands of slaves to build the temple. So even though the temple was one of the wonders of the world, it did have a very seamy side to it, a very sad side. Actually, in archaeology today, they've uncovered some of the old caves that these slaves worked in. They still have some of the pits and the caves that are marked by the candles that they worked under. That is, they had to light it with candles. And so some of those caves they've discovered, these are the dank and dark caves that all the slaves for Solomon worked. So the beauty of Solomon's temple does have that poor side as well. Let's think more generally, however, just for a few moments about what the Bible teaches pertaining to slavery. And this is, of course, one of the issues that we face today, and many people are interested in what the Bible has to say. There are two passages to which I want to call your attention. Number one is 1 Corinthians 7, verses 17 through 24, and you might want to turn to it. We're going to look at this passage, and then we'll look at Colossians chapter 3, verses 22 and following. So there are two passages that speak about slavery. There are more than that, really, but these are two of the primary texts that speak of slavery in the New Testament. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I want to give you a moment to go there. Now let's think about the context as you're traveling to 1 Corinthians. The context is really the chapter regarding marriage. And the question that the Corinthians, many of them had, was, I've now become a Christian, my wife is a pagan, that is, she's a non-Christian, she worships idols, is it my responsibility to leave her? Or a woman might be baptized into Christ. She has a husband who is a non-believer, and she has the question whether or not I should remain married to the non-believing husband. Paul's answer to both of those questions is yes. You remain in the state wherein you find yourself. And that's the context generally, but now he opens it up and he talks about the general principle that he has in mind. And I want you to follow it beginning in verse 17. Only as the Lord has distributed to each man, as God has called each, so let him walk, and so ordain I in all of the churches. Let's pick up the phrases here. Only as the Lord has distributed to each man. What does that mean? That is, whatever state you find yourself in. And he speaks about it as God's providence overseeing it. As the Lord has distributed, that is, whatever state God's providence has put you, when you come into Christ, there remain in that state. Now, that's the general principle. And he says, so ordain I in all of the churches. Now he makes specific application, verse 18. Was any man called, for example, being circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Believe it or not, there were individuals in the first century, Jews, of course, who wanted to retract their circumcision and had operations to do so. Hard to believe, but nevertheless was done. So he tells us, were you called, that is, did you become a Christian when you were circumcised, a circumcised man? Don't seek to become uncircumcised. Then he turns it around. Were you called in uncircumcision? Has any been called in uncircumcision? Let him not seek to become circumcised. Now he makes this principle clear. Circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing but keeping the commandments of God. Let each man abide in the calling wherein he was called. It is of interest to note verse 19 once again, and that is that circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing but keeping the commandments of God. Here, Paul disassociates circumcision with the commandments of God. It has nothing to do with the command of God today. But let each man abide in the calling wherein he was called. Now, what has this to do with the topic at hand? The next specific illustration that Paul uses is in the verse that follows, and I want you to see it. This is verse 21. Were you called being a slave? That is, did you become a Christian? You were a slave when you became a Christian. Were you called being a slave? Care not for it. That is, don't worry about it. Rather, use it. Now, note carefully what he has to say. If you can be free, rather use it. All right, let's stop for a moment. Were you called, that is, did you become a Christian and you were a slave when you became a Christian? Care not for it means simply don't worry about it. There are more important considerations as to whether or not you're a slave or a master. And those considerations are primarily whether you're in Christ or not in Christ. It's exactly what Paul has in mind here. He says, don't worry about it. If you're called, if you become a Christian and you're a slave, care not for it. Even if you can be free, use it rather. That is, don't even take advantage of the opportunity necessarily to be free. Just use your slavery. What is the important principle here? The important principle is there's something more important than whether you're a slave or free, that is, in this world. And that is whether you are in Christ or not in Christ, and whether or not you can utilize whatever station you find yourself in order to further the cause of Jesus Christ. That's what Paul's interested in. And he says, don't even worry about it. Now, let's stop there for a moment. What does this say regarding so much unrest that we see in America, talking about slavery that happened 150 years ago and so-called reparations that should be paid to people who are descendants of slaves? Wrong-headed. Paul says, don't worry about it. Even if you're a slave, don't even worry about it. Don't be concerned with those things. But instead, even if you can be free, don't That's not your goal. The goal is use it. Use whatever station you're in to further the cause of Christ. It's pretty interesting, isn't it? Because he goes on to tell us then, for he that, the next line, by the way, this is verse 22. He that was called in the Lord, being a slave, is the Lord's freedman. That is, if you're called, if you became a Christian and you're a slave, you're the Lord's freedman. If you are called being free, you're the Lord's slave. And that's how Paul handles the entire subject. Now he finishes it off in the final verse, which is verse 24, where he tells us, let each man, wherein he was called, therein abide with God. So what's Paul's answer here? Don't worry about slavery or non-slavery as far as becoming a Christian is concerned. Your goal is not primarily to overturn society, to make sure that someone pays you back for slavery that happened 150 years ago, or even if you're a slave today. That's pretty straightforward talk, isn't it? Now let's look at one other passage and I'll draw some conclusions. This is Colossians chapter 3 and the verses 22 and following. Colossians 3. Slaves, obey in the Lord in all things them that are your masters according to the flesh. Not with eye service. What does that mean, not with eye service? That means not simply for what it looks like, not because you're just trying to make it look good, not with eye service as men pleasers, but he says, rather, instead, in singleness of heart, that is, you have one purpose, you fear the Lord. And he goes on to explain that, whatsoever you do, work heartily as unto the Lord and not unto men. Verse 24, knowing that from the Lord you shall receive the recompense of the inheritance, you serve the Lord Christ. Now that applies in the primary context to slaves. It applies to all of us in whatever task we are employed. You work heartily as unto the Lord, knowing it is from the Lord you shall receive the recompense of the inheritance. That is, it is the Lord who's going to pay you for what you do, how you work, what kind of disposition you take to the job. That's what he's talking about. Now let's go down to chapter 4, verse 1. Masters, render unto your slaves that which is just and equal, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. Here's what I want the masters to do. Now, coming to all of that, let's just think about some of the principles that Paul has outlined. And people are surprised when they read all of this. They say, well, Paul doesn't simply, nor does the Bible anywhere, eradicate slavery with one sledgehammer passage. When you read some passages such as these, some say, well, it seems to endorse slavery. On the other hand, there are passages which seem not to endorse slavery, but to endorse the releasing of slaves, such as Galatians 3, verse 28. We're all one man in Christ Jesus. There's not even Jew or Greek, bond or free, male or female. We're all one man in Christ Jesus. So what is really the principle, or what are the principles that we need to note? Number one, slavery was an institution, an ugly institution to be sure, that was eliminated over time by Christianity and Christian influence. Slavery was an institution that was eliminated by Christian influence over a period of time. R.C.H. Linsky is a famous commentator of yesteryear. He made this comment. He said, regarding slavery, he says, Christianity tolerated slavery until so many people became Christians that slavery could not be tolerated. That's exactly right. Christianity permeates a culture, but it does so one heart at a time. And as it permeates the culture through changing lives, then such institutions as slavery are eliminated. But Paul does not come with one sledgehammer blow and eliminate slavery. Alexander Campbell was asked the same question, and he answered basically the same way. Why does not the New Testament simply condemn slavery in one succinct passage? And his answer was, because Christianity works like leaven. Leaven in a heart and leaven in society. And when Christians are born again, people become Christians, that influence in society changes society from the inside out. But never does it come to society and march around with placards or put a sword in the hand of an individual or a gun in someone's hand and says, go change society as you want it to be changed. No, it doesn't do that. Christianity changes society one heart at a time. Number two, slavery actually is an institution that springs from other ideas. What are those other ideas, by the way? What are the other ideas that really slavery is built upon? Well, primarily, the single idea upon which slavery is built, that not all people are created equal. That different individuals in life, be it men, women, minorities, majority population, they are not equal before God. And that has been the major premise of most all societies in the history of the world, that they're not all equal, not all people are equal. And since not all people are equal, therefore you can readily see how some are born to be slaves and some are born to be masters. Some are born to be in servitude, others are born to be slave owners. Actually, today, that's exactly what Islam practices. Islam teaches in its very holy book, the Quran, slavery. But the reason for that is because the Quran, Muhammad taught that women are only worth one half of a man's worth. And other individuals, such as minorities, are only worth half of what another person is worth. That is, such as the blacks. That's what, matter of fact, Muhammad himself had a black slave. He had him himself to carry his goods. That was because they believe, and Islam teaches, that not all individuals are equal with one another in society. The same thing, you might be surprised to learn, is what Judaism taught. Judaism taught, that is at the time of Christ, that is, now this is traditional Judaism, not the Bible, traditional Judaism, that those who are non-Jews are worth less than Jews. Gentiles, for example, are not even worth the spit upon. Now that's exactly what they put in the holy books. That's how Judaism considers non-Jews, because there are different classes of people, different values of different individuals. That's the premise upon which slavery is built. And that is the premise that Christianity attacks and shows is false, by showing us that we're all equal before God because we're all children of God. Now let's notice number three. I'm going to ask this question: what if Paul had said, slavery is a sin? Right now, get out of slavery. What if he had said that? What would happen to society? What would have happened to that society of the Roman culture? What would have happened to the Greek culture? Well, let me give you an illustration. Let us just say that Joe Biden tells us today that oil is evil, as he does, by the way, and therefore we're going to outlaw any petroleum-based product beginning today. It's against the law to use any petroleum-based product starting now. Well, what's going to happen? Well, society will unravel within a week, won't it? That's exactly what would have happened if Paul had said those words. Society would have completely unraveled right before their eyes, and Christianity would have received the blame for it of destroying societies that it touched. But instead, it has a loving, permeating influence that changes the hearts of people and individuals, families, children, and then eventually societies as Christianity spreads. Here's something else to think about. If Paul had said, slavery is evil, get out of slavery, any master who has a slave, release them, any slave, go free, you know, you would not know at that point, when people became Christians and they were slaves, you would never know what? Whether they were actually converted to Christ or whether they came to the church because they were now released of servitude. They might just as well and probably would be coming because they received freedom from servitude. It's the same thing going on in the border right now. People tell me sometimes, well, there are people coming over, they need a better life. Well, how do you know? As long as we give them big checks to come over, we don't know. We don't know really the motive which they come. You don't know if they're being persecuted or not. You give them money, you hold a carrot in front of them, that's the reason people will come. It's the same thing here. You would never know people coming into Christ, whether they actually came into Christ because they were converted in the heart, or whether because they came because they were now released from servitude. Actually, that is precisely what occurred in the 3rd century, in the 4th century. You remember Constantine? Constantine, the Roman emperor, he made Christianity a legal religion. And then he made Christianity the only legal religion. What happened? Well, floods of people began to come into the church. The churches could not build big enough auditoriums for all the people. The churches swelled with numbers. It was the only legal religion. But they could never tell whether they were really converted or whether, well, I'm going to escape the repercussions of the law. And that's exactly what happened. They brought in all of their idols. They brought in all of their idolatrous practices, all of the superstitions. And lo and behold, you had the Roman Catholic Church born out of such practices as these. And that's how they brought them in, because they made it the only legal religion. You would never know. Paul never said, therefore, Christianity releases slaves from servitude. He didn't say it that way, but the permeation of Christian influence and Christian principles in a person and in a society changes society for the good. Now let's look at slavery in America for just a moment, and then the lesson's going to be yours. Many people criticize America because slavery was in America at one time. Last year, or 2 years ago, Nicole Hannah-Jones of the New York Times put together the 1619 Project, which is now being taught in many schools across America. And the basic premise of Hannah-Jones's work is that America was actually born in 1619, which was the time when the first ship arrived from the West Indies, having indentured servants on that ship. She called them slaves. They were not really slaves, they were indentured servants. And she says, that's the beginning of America, and America was built on slavery. And that's the basic premise of the 1619 Project. Well, let's think about that for just a moment. Number one, and incidentally, she also pointed out, she also made the statement that America basically invented slavery. So thinking about that last premise, think about this. Slavery has been in the history of the world, in all cultures, in all countries of all times. It has been there. What has caused slavery to be eradicated? It's only in one civilization, Western civilization, that has been influenced by the principles of Jesus Christ. I'm speaking about England and America, the only cultures that really have eradicated slavery. Actually, thinking about how the history reads, just going back for a moment, if you think about, for example, Georgia. When it was first established, I believe it was George Oglethorpe, I may be wrong, Oglethorpe was the guy who established Georgia. They put right into the law in 1733, no slavery in Georgia. Why? Because the people were Christians. They believed it was wrong. No slavery. But it was reversed in 1750 by the King of England, who said, no, you don't. You are an English colony. You will keep slavery in Georgia. The same thing happened in other colonies. And these colonies, such as Massachusetts, Vermont eradicated slavery in 1777. They got rid of slavery. Connecticut, New York, all of those states, at that time colonies, they outlawed slavery. And the King of England kept telling them, no, you're not going to get rid of slavery, because they were the ones profiting from the slave trade. And so they disallowed it. Think about Thomas Jefferson for a moment. Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. Remember, he was the third president of the United States. Thomas Jefferson was elected to the House of Burgesses in Virginia in 1768. The first piece of legislation that Thomas Jefferson actually authored himself was the eradication of slavery in the colony of Virginia. He says it's an evil institution, and as he put later, the wrath of God will come upon us if we don't get rid of this institution. What happened? The King of England once again said, not on our watch, you're not going to do it. No, they disallowed that law from being passed. They overstepped the House of Burgesses' action, which is one of the reasons that the Revolutionary War was fought. And Jefferson even put in the Declaration of Independence that they have carried on a slave trade, debasing men and the blacks in this country. The founders actually took out that phrase from the Declaration because some slave states were coming in to the Union, but nevertheless, that was Jefferson's thought on it. And when he wrote in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, he was reflecting the Bible and the idea of a God-given morality and God-given rights. And he reflected the creation that man was created by God. He put it right in the Declaration. Now, I know there are many professors at college today who want to tell us that that did not include the blacks, but Jefferson himself later even tells us in so many words, indeed it did. And he was ashamed that anyone would try to say it didn't include the black people. All men are created equal. It's exactly what they believed. It is only because of Christianity and the influence thereof that slavery was eradicated, Western civilization. So in spite of what Hannah Nicole Jones says, or Nicole Hannah Jones, which is how the name works there, in spite of what she says in the 1619 Project, it is Western civilization and America that really got rid of slavery, didn't invent it. And it was only that, because slavery exists right now in a lot of portions of the world, particularly in Islamic countries. So let's summarize all of this very quickly. I mentioned regarding socialism in several lessons past, and how socialism permeates a culture in a negative way over a period of time, and that's exactly what happens with slavery. So I want you to remember this. When we come to 1 Kings chapter 12, Solomon is now going to be replaced by his son Rehoboam. Rehoboam is actually approached by the men of Judah, and they beg him to get rid of the slavery and servitude, the taxation system that has basically made them slaves. And Rehoboam's answer to them was absolutely not. My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. He said, I am not going to. I'm stronger than he ever thought about being, and I'm not going to release the slavery, and I'm not going to release your taxes. Because the tax burden made it so that they were basically slaves, such as is going on in America today. What happened? The country split. So what began in Solomon's day took many years to ferment, many years to boil up, but finally it ended up in splitting the country because people can't live that way. They recognize inherently the wrongness of it. And that's what happened. But overall, what are we to remember? Christianity works like leaven also. And how we change society primarily is by changing the hearts of individuals by conversion to Christ. And what frightens me about America, not so much about the legislation, even though that scares me, but the fact that we have been so languishing in converting other people to Christianity. Instead, the churches have conformed to the world. And that's what's happening across America right now. Instead of influencing the country for Christianity, the churches have become influenced by our hedonistic culture. And now we have churches that put the imprimatur, their approval, upon what's taking place in America. A sad day indeed. We better get busy with evangelism and thinking about converting people to Jesus Christ. These are the way that influences work in society. Christianity, of course, primarily. The lesson is yours. If you want to respond to the invitation, now's the opportunity. While we stand and sing this song, come to the front. while we sing it.